Are you ready?
Oh, yeah!
From parts unknown and into your home, this is the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. Now, here's your host, Groovy G.
Hello there, folks, and welcome to the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. On this episode, if you're a fan of the hit TV series Young Rock, you would have seen belts made by this man. I'm talking, of course, about Championship Gold's Darren Hall. He joins us right now.
You're watching the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. For your official Groovy G Belt Podcast merchandise, check out www.groovyGshop.com.
Darren Hall, welcome to the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. How are you?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, my pleasure. Hey, let's get stuck straight into it. When and how did you get into wrestling belts?
Well, it goes back probably about 20 plus years ago. I've always been a big wrestling fan, not so much now, but more back in the 80s and the 70s, especially when I was a kid with World Championship Wrestling coming out here to Australia and actually going to see a couple of shows when I used to live in Hobart. Dad used to take us to the City Hall down there in Hobart, and we used to watch these guys. Never missed a show, so that sort of from a young age got me into the wrestling scene. What got me into wrestling belts was I just had a little bit of a fascination for the championship wrestling belts, and then back in the 20 plus years ago, there was only probably only 2 or 3 belt makers around. It was J-Mar was one of them, Reggie Parks was another. I think there was another guy from Florida, but there was nobody else really around making any wrestling belts. So I actually got onto J-Mar and asked him if he could make me up an Australasian heavyweight wrestling belt in the style of the old Intercontinental belt that Randy Savage and Rick Steamboat and all used to had there. So that is now still around at the moment. It's actually in AWF Wrestling in Sydney. Greg Bounds up there has got it, using it as his heavyweight title belt. It took me about 3.5, 4 years before I actually got that in my hands. Paid that out in instalments first up there with J-Mar, and I knew that the process was going to be a hefty one with him, but I wasn't expecting it to be 3.5 years. But anyway, when I got it, I thought, well, you know, it's a good-looking belt, probably not worth waiting 3.5 years for, but I got it, and but in the process of waiting for J-Mar's belt, I actually bought a couple of custom belts from Reggie Parks. Back and then, when I bought those, the Aussie dollar was only like about 62 cents. So these particular belts cost me about $2,500 each. Once you pay for postage and customs duty into Australia, and I got the belts, and I thought, you know what? Not a lot of people would be able to afford $2,500 for a belt. That's where the logic and the thinking got into me, thinking about how I could get into this sort of field, because at that particular time, as I said, only a couple of belt makers in the world around, and they were, you know, hefty price belts that they was producing. Good quality and probably, you know, well worth the money at the time, but not your average Joe Blow could afford these things. So that's probably where I got into wrestling, where I actually got into the wrestling belts. And then as we move forward with our talks today, we'll get more into the details of how we went forward and how I went forward into the wrestling belts business.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Now, do you remember a particular belt that really caught your eye and you really thought, hey, that's something I'd like to look at a little bit further?
My favourite belt of all time is the Uwf Heavyweight Belt. Obviously, that was made by Reggie Parks back in the day. Was used probably not for a very long time with that promotion, but there was probably, I don't know what it is about that particular belt, but it just something about it just attracts me to it. I know that there's a lot of really good-looking belts out and about there, but that one at particular time, and still to this day, is probably one of my favourite belts. Never ever had one, never ever made one, but yeah, probably my favourite belt.
Now, do you have a current collection today?
Funny story that, because when I first got into belt making, at the beginning, I thought, yep, I'll make myself that one, and I'll make that one, and I'll set myself up a nice little display thing in the lounge, and I'll make that one. But as time went on and business grew, I never ever sort of got around to actually making anything for myself. So no, I don't have a collection at all of anything.
And that's a bit strange considering you are a belt maker. Let's get into the belt making side of things. Do you remember the first belt you made? How you went about it, the process, and maybe the what was it for, that kind of thing?
Oh, now you're testing the brain cells. We would have to be going back about, I think it was about 17 years ago. And Greg Bounds from AWF actually got in contact with me when I first started, and World Series Wrestling was coming out to Australia. It was Jeff Jarrett and Rhino, and a lot of the big names. They was doing the tours around Melbourne, Sydney, a few other places as well. And he asked me to do a wrestling belt for this particular promotion that was coming over, World Series Wrestling. So I did that. So that particular one was centrifugal zinc casting. So what that is, there was a company in Tasmania that I used for this particular project where they used to do what they call spin casting. So they made the mould of the design. So I obviously did the design up for the World Series Wrestling belt. That I then sent that to this particular company in Tassie that did the spin casting. They took that art into making it into a mould. They actually got the plates made in, I think it was magnesium. And then from that they made the moulds from that, and then spin cast the zinc alloy into making these plates. So quite a quick process to do when it's actually the moulds and everything are done, and then you can use the moulds over and over and again if you wanted it. But because this was a custom built, never got around to actually doing any extras other than this one. So that was the first belt that I had ever made. So obviously I'd never done anything with leather before, and never done anything with anything else within a wrestling belt. So I had to sort of go off photos. I had good help from a leather shop in Hobart that I used to go and buy my leather from. I used to take photos into them, and I used to say, how do they do this? How do they do that? And they showed me the leather tools that we used to do all these sort of things. So I just sort of just had to look and learn and look at photos and try the best as I could for this particular belt. And it turned out good in the end. I obviously was used on the shows, and I think it is still about to this day, so 17, 18 years later.
So you talk about that process of, well, back in those days, there was probably only a handful of people that actually made the real belts that were used on TV. And you said that there wasn't a lot of information out there. How did you get into the acid-etched type of plates?
Well, I had a brief times there that I was in contact with one of the belt makers in America that worked with Reggie Parks at the time, Dave Milliken. He was the one who actually told me, I just sort of came blatantly straight out and asked him how did they use an engraver, or how did they go about getting the plates. And so he was the one that actually told me that they use acid etching on zinc material. So that's where I got the idea from, on how, did a little bit of Google on that, and got some information on actually what acid etching was and how it all worked and everything like that. So But he was the one that actually put me on to knowing, because I didn't, at the time, didn't know how they did these plates. I just thought it was engraved plates or they were cast, but obviously the acid etching was more economical, cheaper on price at the end and everything like that. So that's where I got onto that.
And that's very interesting you say that, because up until only maybe a couple of years ago in the belt collecting community, a lot of those things were kept secret as well too. Now, I don't know whether people like to keep things kayfabe or secret in the belt collecting world because they like to keep it a little bit mysterious like the wrestling industry, or whether it's only a handful of people that actually make the belts and that's their living, so they don't want to give away all their secrets. But I'm surprised that Dave Milliken gave that information away to you.
Yeah, well, I was quite surprised, and we didn't have a friendship or anything like that. We actually had a little bit of a rough and tumble little beginning when I first started out. Probably because I was asking too many questions, as you say there. They don't want to give away too much information to an up and coming or just somebody that wanted to take away from their business. So. But look, at the end of the day, he wasn't going to tell me too much. Just like you said, they just want to keep it a little bit quiet on how they do sort of things. But yeah, he did tell me that part of it. And obviously, nobody does acid etching on zinc material here in Australia. They do acid etching on brass, but no acid etching on zinc. So. So I was sort of I was at a wit's end at that particular time because I didn't know where to go to get these sort of things and didn't know what the prices and all that were when I at the beginning. So it took me a good 12 months of investigating, doing some research on how I was going to make this work, because I didn't want to be a Reggie Parks. I didn't want to be a Dave Milliken, because they already had that part of the wrestling belt world in their palm of their hand, because they was producing these things. They had the rights to all those TV belts that we've grown up with, and they was making good quality belts. But like for when I was, for me, $2,500 for a belt wasn't what I would say the Joe Blow could afford. So when you've got a wrestling promotion that's just up and coming, and they've got 4 or 5 champions that they want belts for, I mean, it's going to be impossible for them to be able to pay out $2,500 Australian or whatever the equivalent was at the time in US dollars to be able to give their champions, a respectable belt. So that's where all this research and everything I did for 12 months was, how can I be more economical and make a cheaper version at a better price where these other people can afford a decent sort of wrestling belt that their champions can be seen with. Like I said, I didn't want to be at the top end of the belt-making industry because that was already taken. But nobody was making like the cheaper style belts at the time, and we're talking, very early 2000s. Nobody was making a cheaper version of a wrestling belt. So it took me a while to actually research on how I could make it more affordable, as well as, because I was working full-time at the time, so it wasn't as if I was relying on this wage from these belts to come in to support myself and my family. I was already working a full-time job. So this was just a hobby on the side that, I just got a little bit of coin for doing something that I enjoyed. And so it just sort of went from there. So I just wanted to be able to produce something that was affordable for, the average sort of person and for wrestling promotions that were up and coming.
Now, if somebody wanted to get a belt made, what's the process like? They ask you, do they draw concept designs for you? How does it all work?
Well, some send me a concept, and it could be just a hand-drawn something on a scrap piece of paper, and they say they want this on there, heavyweight wrestling champion just written on there, and or they will just say, look, I'm after a particular wrestling belt, or it doesn't have to be these day and age. It's not just wrestling or boxing. It's just any sport, anything also. Look, I've done a lot of different things that have nothing to do with wrestling or boxing. Dance belts I've done, golf belts, baseball belts, racing belts, 21st birthday belts, you name it. I'm probably pretty much salesman of the year. So it's they just sort of, if they don't do a drawing concept for me, then they will just say, look, I'm after a salesman of the year belt. I want salesman of the year and in the banners on the centre plate with this my company's logo in the middle. On the side plates, I want, where I can put nameplates of the particular winners for each salesman of the year or whatever it will be. And then I have an artist that designs all the wrestling belts or all the designs for me. He's from Virginia over in America, and he's a really good artist. So I send him either the drawing of what they want or the information that they want on this particular belt, and then he draws it up for me, sends me over a coloured version of what the end product would look like, and then I would send that to the customer and say, this is what we've come up with on this particular design. Any changes that you want, just let me know and we'll get them changed. So 9 times out of 10, you'll send them a design and they'll go, yep, that's spot on, just how I want it. We're good to go. Or, the other 1 times out of 10, they will come back changed. I'm not real happy with that part there. And we will just go back and forth with my designer and the customer until they're 100% happy, and then we move forward from there.
And what's the hardest part about making a belt?
The hardest part of making a belt is, for me, I think, is the leather work. I mean, I'm not, and I don't mind saying it, is I'm not the best leather person out there. I mean, there's a lot of really good leather guys out there that are doing just the leather straps and everything like that, rather than just making full belts. They're just doing re-leathers and everything, and they got really, really good. But for me, once again, it goes back to the cost price. I like to keep my costs down still, just for the everyday Joe Blow, and that includes, I just do a standard leather designs and stamping. I don't go overboard with it. I know that it can take a lot of time that the other guys do to get these wrestling straps perfect. But that's probably the worst part of the whole thing is actually doing the leather part on my side. Cutting it out, doing the template, tooling it all up and everything like that, down on hands and all fours and that, doing leather work on concrete floor, and that it sort of gets a little bit monotonous after a while, especially when you've got to do 10 or 12 straps a day or something like that. It starts to get a little bit monotonous. But yeah, that's probably the worst part of the belt making is the leather for me. I mean, I know the leather guys that are out there that do the straps that's their favourite part, but for me, that's not my favourite.
Now, your belts were recently used. We would have seen them on TV. They were used in the TV series Young Rock. How did you come about making those particular belts?
So Young Rock was filmed in Brisbane, and the acting company up there, or the company that was in charge of doing all the shooting and everything like that of the series up there, got in contact with me from my webpage and asked me was I interested in doing. They wanted to do 4 belts for the Young Rock. So 2 of those particular belts were just going to be background props. You would have seen them on the stand behind where the Rock's grandmother used to sit. They were the ones at the very top, and then she had her husband's main belt sitting right about head height, just a little bit above head height on there. But yeah, there was a couple of the first 2 that I made were just prop belts, so they were just plain and simple. Their art department from the studio sent me the artwork for those, and then I just engraved them out in brass. They were nothing fancy, didn't have any plating or anything like that. They were just polished brass that I then sprayed with lacquer to stop them from tarnishing, and then they were just put on a very simple strap and didn't have to worry about doing any backing leather or anything like that because they weren't going to be seen. They were only in a couple of shots. Then they asked me to do the Peter Mayavera Polynesian belt, but because of copyright, they weren't allowed to use the original design. WWE wouldn't allow them to use the original belt that Peter Maivera actually did hold. So then their art department came up with concept of that. So once again, they sent that to me. I engraved that out, and then it actually got gold plated and got all the works done to that one there, because that one was one of the main belts that was on the first season. And then they were going to do the fourth belt, and then they got back to me and said, look, the director doesn't want to do the last belt now. And I said, yep, that's fair enough, no worries. And then probably a couple of weeks after that, they came back to me and said, look, the director's changed his mind. We do now want the fourth belt. The fourth belt is been actually on the show as of yet, but it is the Rocky Johnson, Tony Atlas WWF tag team belt. Once again, due to copyright with the WWE, we weren't allowed to use the original design, so we had to come up with another concept which was similar but not close, that it would be infringe copyright. So that one hasn't been used as of yet. I'm guessing that one is going to be used on the second season. So that one turned out really well too, so that'll be good to see that on TV.
That is pretty cool. Now, is that the coolest thing you've seen done with some of your belts?
Well, quite a few years ago, I did make a Major League Baseball belt for the Major League Baseball Network in the US. And that belt was actually on the TV on Major League Baseball Network, which I think is probably the second or the third most watched show in the US. And that was probably a pretty good that was probably a highlight of my career up until the Young Rock days. But yeah, that was good to actually see. They sent me a video of it, because obviously we don't get Major League Baseball Network here in Australia. So they sent me over a video of that particular one on their network, and that looked pretty cool on TV. So yeah, that was at the time was probably the highlight of my belt career. I've also made belts for the WWE, their greatest fan belt when they came out to Australia. I think it was 2016, 2017. They came out for 2 years, and I made the greatest fan belts for them, which handed out to the winners in each state that they came and toured to, and give I think it was like a 1 minute video on why they would consider themselves WWE's greatest fan. And they picked a winner out of each state. I think it was Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, and I think maybe one time there was New Zealand as well. So, and then the wrestlers would one of the wrestlers would be in the ring, and then they would get the winner of the particular belt into the ring there, and one of the wrestlers from the WWE would then hand them the winning belt for that. So that was also good. That was on, I think one of the shows was a pay-per-view here in Australia, and the belt was on there. So that was also another highlight. But yeah, I think the Young Rock TV show at this particular stage is probably the highlight of my belt making business and career. So yeah, no, it's good to get something like that, and knows that you're doing something right.
Very much so. Now, is there one belt design that has grown on you over the years?
Really, I think I've seen so many different... Are you talking about from my designs or from the wrestling belts in itself?
Maybe just wrestling belts altogether.
There is one particular title from Randy Jackson from Top Rope Belts. Now, a story between... There's another story about me and Randy Jackson. Randy Jackson and I was actually partners when I first started making wrestling belts. I sold a wrestling belt on eBay that I had bought from another belt maker in the US. And Randy happened to buy this particular belt off me off eBay. Him and I got talking and started to get the ball moving once I'd done all my research on how I was going to do bits and pieces. And then he had a wealth of knowledge as well on a few things. So he was, at the beginning, was the guy that would get the orders, and I was the guy that used to make them. So I would make them. I would charge Randy the cost of what I was going to charge, and then Randy would then charge the customer on what he was going to do. So we did that for maybe 12 or 15 months. We did that, and then Randy, we were only doing the cheaper option belts. You know, we was making them from acid etch brass, and obviously those that know the difference between brass and zinc is that brass is a lot harder and denser material. So it doesn't acid etch as deep as zinc. So that's why they use zinc, because you get a deeper cut into the zinc. But with brass, because it's so hard, is that you can't acid etch it for too long, because not only does it go down, it also goes out. So you can't acid etch it for too long. So we were only getting shallow etches at the beginning. And look, at the beginning that was good enough. We was getting the orders coming in. Actually, we got quite a few orders when we first started, probably because we were the new kids on the block. There wasn't too many of us around other than the big names. And, so that's where that started. But Randy wanted to then move on and make the more prestigious designs and belts, and he's done very, very well for himself. And I commend him for his actually going up against Reggie Parks and Dave Milliken with the quality of belts that he produces. And, and there's one of his belts, I'm not 100% sure I did, one of his earlier on belts that he made, and the design still sticks in my head as probably one of the best belt designs that it was probably his best that I'd seen. I can't remember, I think it was for WWC in Puerto Rico, I think that they used it. But I can't recall exactly what it was. But that one has always stuck in my mind as probably one of the best-looking design belts that I have seen.
Randy Jackson, of course, the owner of Top Rope Belts in the States, has gone on to, as you say, a very successful career with a lot of those high-end type of belts.
Absolutely.
You've talked about the thing you hate the most about making a belt in the leather. What's your favourite part of making a belt?
Favourite part of making a belt is getting that email from the customer when they received it, and just how wonderful their reaction is to it. That I like to get those emails that say, the pictures don't do it any justice. Seeing it in real life, you've done an amazing job. The concept that's come through. This is what I envisioned that it was going to look like at the end of the day, or it was even better than what they had envisioned. I think that's the customer satisfaction to me is probably the best part of doing this, is that obviously we are doing, and the customers are paying, a decent amount of money for these things. So I always like to hear back that I've done what they wanted, or if not more than what they expected. And that's probably what makes it, all worthwhile at the end.
Now, you talked about before when you first started up Championship Gold, you wanted to be a cheaper alternative. What are your thoughts on the current cheaper alternatives coming in from Pakistan? That they've really ramped up in the last couple of years or so.
Oh, yeah, I know. There's so many of them now. Look, you get what you pay for. It's always the same saying, is that you get what you pay for. Look, I've had to repair a lot of the Pakistan belts, especially when it comes to the leather, or it comes to having them replated. A lot of customers are asking them to, or if they can be replated, because the plating is off, or it's faded, or something's just not right with it, it's blistered, things like that. So over the years, I've worked on many Pakistani belts to repair them, fix them up. But at the end of the day, I mean, they're there for a point of difference. They're there for those that, want something on the cheap. especially if it's one of their favourite belts that they've seen on TV and they don't want to pay $2,500 for. They can pick it up for $300 or $400. That's fine with me if that's what they want to do. You can't twist their arms and say, look, don't go to them, come to me. It's up to the customer on what they want to spend their hard-earned money on. So at the end of the day, if they come to me and say they want it fixed, I'll fix it. But, yeah, if they want to go to these guys and get their belts from them, I mean, that I don't see any reason why they can't do that. Obviously, Classic Shields at the moment is probably the best Pakistan belt maker over there, probably making top quality etched belts. But then again, you are paying for what you get as well because they're high end that they're doing and they're charging high end prices. So, at the end of the day, it is whatever you pay for, it's whatever you get. So, the more you pay, you would hope that the better quality it would be. And obviously, if you're only paying peanuts for it, then you're only going to get, a certain quality. So it's all up to the customer on what they want and what they expect. So I don't have any issues with it. It is what it is.
If money was no object, would you have just one belt that you would like to own? And if so, what would that be?
That would be the Uwf Heavyweight Belt that we talked about earlier.
Okay. That's a pretty... you came to that conclusion pretty quickly?
Yeah, well, like I say, that's probably the only belt that's sort of... From the TV, that from what I can recall, I mean, in Australia, we didn't have... when we go back to the 80s and that, we didn't have wrestling on TV like they did in the US. So I was always a wrestling magazine fanatic. I mean, I've still got wrestling magazines that I collected here from the 70s and the 80s still sitting here, and that's how I got into knowing all these different wrestlers back in the time, because it wasn't until probably late 80s before we started getting some video coming through from the US that we could use here and watch in Australia. I think WrestleMania was one of the first videos that actually I got here to watch, and then I bought another couple of NWA videos from out of a wrestling magazine sent over from the US, and then you had to get them converted from NTSA to VHS to PAL, so we could watch them on our VHS systems here in Australia. So, so I grew up early days with wrestling magazines, and always used to see that the UWF, when UWF came on board, and then I seen this particular belt in the magazines. I would have only been in my teens at the time, or early 20s and that. So that's probably where it stuck into my mind. And then, once YouTube came in the later years, then you could actually see the belt in action on the screen. Sort of makes it just that little bit better.
Now, one thing I forgot to ask when we were talking about the belt making process, CNC. Now, you've recently, it's a new innovation. I guess the next step on from acid etching. What's your take on CNC?
So I wanted to get a CNC machine probably about a year or two after I started doing wrestling belts, just so as I could engrave a set of plates. Like, you can engrave a set of plates in one day, and then the next day you can have them sent off to the platers, and the turnaround time is just so much better. But back, in the early 2000s, I had no idea, just like I didn't have any idea on when I first started making wrestling belts, on what a CNC machine does, what it could do, if it could do what I wanted it to do. I asked a lot of questions, didn't really get a lot of good answers back in the day when I first started asking about CNC machines, and then the prices of them was extraordinarily high to be able to do what I wanted it to do if it could actually do it. So then it took me, would have been about 3.5, 4 years ago now, not long after we moved from Tasmania to Victoria. Then I got onto a guy. The built business was going really, really well. I had some extra money in the bank, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to go out and buy a CNC machine so I can just see if I can do this sort of stuff that I want to do. So I rang a guy up, and he came around, and I explained to him, and I showed him some plates that I had here, and I said, look, this is what I'm currently doing. I want a CNC machine that's going to give me this quality or something similar that I can use. So he goes, oh, yep, no worries, I've got the exact machine for you. I said, yep, no. I said, you're 100% sure that it can do this? It can do this stuff that's going to be just like this or very much similar? And he goes, yep, we can do that. It's all about how you put in all the inputs and everything into the software and what sort of tools that you're going to be using when you use your cutters. So we bought this first machine. It was a Roland EGX 400. So it has an engraving size of 300mm by 400mm, which was plenty big enough for doing this sort of stuff. We set it up. He came around. I went out and I bought some 3mm engraver's brass. Now, engraver's brass has got a little bit of touch of lead in there to make it a little bit softer and better to engrave. And we bought the software, and he came around. He showed me how to input the designs into the software, how to work out all the parameters of all the tooling paths that we need to do and how deep we could go for each path. And the software actually gives you an end look of what it's going to look like before you start engraving, which I thought was really, really good. So if you needed to make any changes, you could make those changes prior to actually starting to engrave, and then you don't get wasting material. So we did all that, and we tried a little bit of stuff in MDF first because obviously we didn't want to waste the metal material. So we did a lot of the designs just in MDF just to see how fast we could have the engraver going, how deep we could go in any one path, and get an idea of what the finished product would be. So from the MDF, we then moved on to the brass, and then sort of worked out what was best. And it's still, to this day, 3.5 years later, I still have to make certain adjustments to it to get a better finish. It's all ongoing learning lesson, I guess. But I've sort of got it down pat now on how it all goes, just making sure that the machine bed is absolutely flat. And I find that sometimes the material, like the brass, may not always be super flat, and that you might get raised there. So you've got to just make sure that everything is as flat as possible to get an even cut right across the plate. And then, so I bought that first one, and then it was quite noisy, so I had to get a soundproofed cabinet made to actually be able to use it, because it was in MDF, it was quite quiet. But once you started engraving into metal, it was quite loud and would echo out and around the neighbourhood. And when you got this thing going for 8 or 9 hours at a time, it could get quite a bit painful on the ears for the neighbours. So I had to get the soundproofed enclosure done for it, which is money well spent, because now you can hardly hear it, and the traffic normally just drowns it out now. So whatever noise does leak out of the soundproof boxes, you can't hear it from the road, and the neighbours definitely wouldn't be able to hear it. So now I can have it running, 8 or 9 hours at a time and not have to worry about pissing the neighbours off. And then I had a look on eBay one particular time there, and somebody was selling exactly the same engraving machine that had only done about 25 hours of work, and it wasn't what that particular customer wanted for what they were making. So they wanted to sell it, and they sold it for a fairly cheap price compared to the original new. And I thought, well, you know what, I'm going to buy that because it's always good to have an extra one there because obviously at the moment these belts are in demand again, and when we had a little bit of a quiet spot over COVID. But now things are starting to ramp back up again, and they did ramp back up before COVID. So I bought an extra machine as well. Now I had to buy an extra soundproof enclosure again. But, so now I've got 2 engraving machines and I can have them running side by side, and I can knock out a set of plates now in less than half a day. One machine can be doing the side plates, the other machine can be doing the centre plate. I've run 2 computers, so the same software on each computer, loading everything that needs to be loaded in. And, so it's all about, for me, getting the quality there and then getting the turnover done, especially, some customers want, when they ring up or they email and they want their belts, the first thing they always say is, what's your turnaround time? So the quicker you can get it to the customer, the better. I know some want it in a week's time, which is virtually impossible. But, some, if they want it in 4 weeks' time, well, then that doing it this way is you're able to actually do it in 4 weeks, get it to the platers, get it back, do the leather and everything like that. So that was probably where it was a good thing to actually go down that road and do the CNC. Completely different to acid etching, and they're never, ever going to be the same. But it works for me. You've got to make sure that your designs don't have a lot of open spaces. When I say open spaces on the design, if you look at something like the old Intercontinental belt that Randy Savage had, there's a lot of open spaces in there that have been etched away. Probably not good for the engraver to do that sort of stuff because the engraver does leave engraving lines on the bottom of the metal that you've engraved away. You can polish most of it out, but some of it, especially in the corners and that, is very, very hard to get out of that. And it is visible. You can see it on some of the CNC work that comes out of Pakistan, especially if you get it in the right light. I think a lot of their photos that they take it in a certain light that you can't actually see the engraving marks. But they are there, and, it's just that's just different. But if you've got a lot like a big gold that's got a lot of fillers in it, or a lot of these belts that I'm actually doing here at the moment that have got a lot of filler and they cover up all those big areas that would normally be acid etched away, it's perfect. It comes out really, really well. And, so I don't have any qualms with that sort of stuff. If I have a design that has a lot of opened areas, then I will just get them acid etched. But if it's got a lot of filler, then I will engrave them myself.
That's really exciting, the future of belt making that's happening now. Now, how do people get in contact with you if they want to have a look at your work or they want to get a belt made?
So the website is www.championshipgold.com.au. So Championship Gold is one word. I'm also on Facebook as well as Championship Gold on Facebook. So they can just go onto the website. There's an email address there. There's a pricing guide there as well, but the pricing guide is just a guide because regular customers that come back, if I have a customer that buys a belt or a wrestling promotion or whatever promotion it is, that buys one belt from me and they come back a second time, I always offer discounts because, if they're happy with the first one and they're coming back to me again, because this day and age, there's a lot of belt makers out there now. There's a lot of belt makers out there. So to be able to have a customer come back and buy another belt or come back and buy another 2 or 3 belts, I like to offer them, an incentive to come back to me, and I offer them a discount. So the price guide on the website is, as I said, only a guide. There's prices on there for 3mm brass that I use and 4mm zinc. Obviously, the 4mm zinc is a little bit more expensive because I have to import the zinc in from overseas because we can't buy it here in Australia. And I do engrave in zinc as well. Zinc does engrave really, really well. It's just I don't use it very often because it is quite expensive to get it into the country, and the price of zinc at the moment has skyrocketed. So I do try to avoid using zinc at the moment because I can buy brass locally, but a lot of customers want 4 mil and I can't get 4 mil brass. I can only get 3 mil or 5 mil, and 5 mil is a little bit too thick and too heavy for a wrestling belt. 3 mil is good in weight-wise, but, yeah, a lot of people are a little bit fanatic about 3 mil and 4 mil. But, yeah, so I can only get 4 mil in zinc, but it is a lot more expensive to buy the zinc in. So just for them to realise that they will be paying a little bit more if they wanted the zinc belt. But, yeah, the website's got photos on there, contact details. It's got any current belts that I may have made that I'm selling on there. Everything else is on there, and introduction page, or they can contact me on Facebook. But other than that, yeah, that's pretty much it.
Darren Hall, thanks for joining me on the Groovy G Championship Belt podcast.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.
You're watching the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast. For your official Groovy G Belt Podcast merchandise, check out www.groovygshop.com.
Now, let's take a sneak peek at what's coming your way on the next Groovy G Championship Belt podcast.
On the next episode of the Groovy G Championship Belt Podcast.
On the next episode of the Groovy G Championship Belt podcast, we'll be taking a closer look at one of the most popular designs of all time. I'm talking, of course, about a J-Mar-made WWE Undisputed Heavyweight Wrestling Championship. Until then, make sure you don't miss a thing by subscribing to this YouTube channel, and you can join in the conversation on Twitter at Groovy G Belt Show or on Facebook. Until then, take care. It's bye for now.